we're going to invite you to be part of kind of a thought experiment today. We're going to try to reframe a little bit the dominant narrative about the climate reality and see, whether together we can figure out how that might orient that new narrative, that narrative that we're going to play with together might sort of reorient our action. So that's our plan for today, and we're calling it Another Planet. So we're going to take you to another planet. What we want to think with you about is actually building on that picture a bit to imagine that we humans just landed on a planet that's quite similar to Earth as we knew it, right? But it's not quite the same. It's too hot. It's getting hotter. As we get comfortable with this new planet that we've landed on, we understand that if we applied some of our most advanced scientific understanding and our engineering methods, as well as our indigenous and nature-based practices, that this new world could become a perfect home for us. We could turn it into a thriving, living planet, just like Earth used to be. And what would we do? What would we do if we landed on this kind of unique planet? We want to dig in a little bit more deeply into the crisis, because we need to have that as a background. None of this is brand new to you. It's just all part of the reframing of our new narrative. And so, we live comfortably, most of us. We live with all kinds of goods and services and gadgets. And of course, that comes from a particular way of going about getting these gadgets organized and these products made.
I mean, we do have small and growing amount of renewable energy, but right now we run our whole day-to-day lives by digging deep into the ground and bringing up this oil and gas, and then we burn it and use it to really power everything we do. All our transportation, all our manufacturing, everything in our day-to-day lives is running on this.
And in the process, we're spewing 162 million tons of this warming pollution into this atmosphere. Again, this is all familiar to you. We just need it as a background to the conversation we're going to have in a minute. What's really extraordinary is that this energy that's trapped by this global warming is equivalent to 600,000 Hiroshimas every day. So basically 5 Hiroshimas a second is what we're seeing. Amount of energy that we're putting into the atmosphere, and that they get trapped because of this.
So in addition, while we're putting out heat and we're putting out gases, the sun continues to put out heat as well, and its sun's rays come to our planet every day. But traditionally, many of these rays have then hit the planet and they bounce back up into space. But what's happening is that as we put up many of these greenhouse gases, and someone said to us recently, it's too bad they're clear. If we could see these, we'd know it was there. But this ceiling is getting thicker and thicker, and so it traps those gases, and the heat and the gas and radiation stays inside our planet.
They stay there. Right?
Yeah, and so they're still there. So we still have that ceiling. So even if we reduced our emissions to zero, which we can't quite do yet, but we all only had electric cars, if we only had solar or other renewable energy, it really wouldn't matter so much, because, well, it would matter, it'd make a big difference, but it wouldn't solve our problem still, because we still have 1 trillion tons or 1,000 gigatons that we've already put up in our atmosphere. And so all the things we've seen before are where we're having an effect from that. Another way to look at it is in parts per million. And so you could look at this graph would actually go much farther back to the left in terms of back 4 million years, where the greenhouse gas has always been in this range between, maybe going up to 290 at most. And in 1950, we just broke through that and basically are going just straight up. And so what's important to know for us, if this was back in spring of this year, we were at 420 plus parts per million. There have never been any humans alive at this time. We are the first.
In that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah,
right.
So there have never been humans at over 300 parts per million. So we are experimenting on ourselves and all the life around us, because for the last 4 million years, that's not what life has been used to.
So we thought it might be a good idea to kind of take that in and realize that what we're
take a breath,
breathing,
just,
right? Just sort of
take a breath and just think about that. Think about how big of our day-to-day life we're going on. Things are good, and how do we enable really experience what we know, to know what we know.
And what we know is what the world looked like when it was at 400 parts per million, 3 million years ago. We can actually track back to what it looked like. And basically it was 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. The Northern Hemisphere was ice-free. Sea levels were 18 meters higher, 130 kilometers further inland. And so that's really the world that we are basically, that's currently baked in. Right?
For us in the US, the state
speaking of baked.
Yeah, it is baked in, literally. For us in the US, the state of Florida was underwater. So now people will ask, there's a wonderful video by Maureen Ramo, who started the climate school at Columbia University in New York. And what she used the example of a frozen lasagna, because someone said, well, Florida's not underwater now. It did just get hit by huge hurricanes, but it's most of it is still above water. And so why aren't we underwater now if we have so many parts per million? And she said, it's like setting the thermostat, right? So you're going to bake, you've got a frozen lasagna, you're going to put it in the oven, you set the temperature on what you want it to be. And you check it 5 minutes later, the lasagna is still frozen. You check it 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, it's getting a bit warmer, but it's still pretty frozen. But you know that the temperature is going to get to where you set it on the oven, and you know the lasagna is going to cook. And so that's what's happened. We haven't experienced it yet, but we absolutely know where it's going. The thermostat is set.
And the heat's going up.
And we see it already, right? We do know that the heat is going up. We can experience that oven that we're living in getting warmer year by year by year by year.
Here's something else other than the heat, right? So when the CO2 goes into the oceans.
So if the oceans absorb a third of that heat and also a third of the CO2, so what happens is the CO2, carbon dioxide, turns into carbonic acid, and it makes the ocean water much more acidic. And the projections are that it'll be 170% more acidic by the end of the century. And that's just too acidic for 97% of the ocean life. So we thought that's another time to take a breath, because it's not what we intend. We're trying to go to work, raise families, feed families, build places for people to live. We're trying to build good things because of the system underlying the way we do that. We don't intend to kill all the life in the ocean, but what happens if we can look at that's what's happening.
So just a few more slides for background, and then we'll move on to what are we actually going to do? How can we reframe this story? And so the other thing, of course, are the tipping points that are increasingly, it's getting clear that we've crossed, or very much in the process of crossing those critical tipping points. One of which is, the area that holds a lot of methane and carbon under frozen ground, basically in the permafrost. And so we had 38 degrees Celsius in the Arctic Circle in 2020, 39 degrees in 2021. It's continuing to go up, and it causes critical disruption of permafrost.
For me, this is one of the iconic or most symbolic pictures about what's happening. So in terms of a tipping point. So this is, we know that we put up a lot of CO2 and methane emissions, but now what's happening is the Earth is putting up its own set. This is a picture of a methane hole, where as the permafrost melts, remember there's been a ceiling in the atmosphere, but there's a ceiling around the Earth and all the lands closer to the poles, right? So as that land has been frozen, but as it begins to melt, the gas can bubble up, and at times it's just exploding out into the atmosphere. So it lets itself out. It doesn't even need, if we cut all of our emissions, nature has much more methane underground than we've put up so far, and it's starting to let itself out.
Speaking of it letting itself out, this to me was one of the most stunning pieces of research that just came out a few months ago from actually ETH, Swiss Technical University, and a few other universities in collaboration. But they looked at these thaw slumps and thaw ponds in the Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia, and they found a 43-fold increase of these slumps in 10 years. Between 2010 and 2021, they found a 43-fold increase of these thaws, which also led to a 28-fold increase of carbon mobilization. Carbon mobilization means methane. It means CO2 pouring out of these areas that are thawing away. And, as you think about 43-fold in the last 10 years, what does it mean in the coming 10 years? So, these are critical developments. And, here is this realization. Remember, it started with that beautiful picture of the blue marble 50 years ago. And here we are having all this information and understanding of what's going on?
So we're actually the first generation to know this. My parents didn't know it. My grandparents didn't know it. But we're also the last generation to be able to do something about it. So it's us.
So that's what we want to look at. And we want to reframe this reality in a way that we get into a different level of understanding, you know, building on this understanding and stepping into action that is now required. So, you know, mostly we still think that we're on this remarkable, beautiful, familiar planet, right? That's where we belong. That's where we are. And we kind of feel if only we reduce our emissions, we can get back to that. It's going to be fine. It's going to be okay. But actually, given all that we've just looked at, all the information we have, 43-fold thaw slumps, things of that nature, we're actually finding ourselves on a very new planet, on a planet we've never lived before, right? In our entire history, the atmosphere has never been what it was. So what would happen if we actually embraced that? If we embraced the notion that we're finding ourselves on a new planet, and that our task now is that we must turn Earth back into a livable planet again. That's our task now, just the way we would do if we were actually landing on another planet that was nearly perfect, but just not quite, right? We would look at what's required for us to adapt to the reality of that planet, right? What do we need to do to adjust to the realities of a somewhat different atmosphere, of a continuous heating in the atmosphere? We would look at how to reduce the things that cause the problem. What do we need to do to lessen the impact of whatever it is that's going on? We would do what we could to remove what's causing the problem, right? We would actively cool that planet, and we would do what we could to restore the biosystems, to have the capacity to actually, you know, nurture the natural resources, you know, the creatures, to actually find back to a balance of life on that new planet. So now, with all that, with just a background that shows you just how critical this moment is and how we need to reorient ourselves to move into a different level of action as if we had landed on a different planet, we want to take you into a bit of a view in preparation for your think tank. So this is the main point of this conversation, which is how can we get to a mind shift where we say, how can we work together on creating a livable planet again by adapting, learning tools for adaptation, interventions for adaptation, for reduction, for removing what can't be there anymore, the toxins out of the oceans. Heike, I'm thinking of you. You know, there's a lot going on in the oceans where we have to think about how to remove things, to cool things actively down, and to restore. And so with that, you know, how do we envision this? As a leader, how do you engage your people to create a community of action around what's coming and what must be done?
And I want to clarify one thing, because I think the cooling, we see things written about reducing and removing. Just to say, for the cooling, there are a lot of people who are researching are the things that we can put up into the atmosphere, particularly in the poles, to reflect sunlight back.
Yeah,
so it's called active cooling. So it's not taking greenhouse gas out. It's sending sunlight back up in places to say, can we protect the ice? Can we keep things cool in the poles? The poles are warming even quicker than anything else. So just to kind of clarify because I think it's newer, it's not written about nearly as much as some of the other categories.
But, you know, it's also, that's a really important point. So there we talk about terraforming kind of technologies and things of that nature, but think of you being a roofing company, right? And if you take that seriously and say, we just can't put up black roofs anymore, let's change that, right? Or whoever you are, think about those 5 elements that we need to.
So it's not always dealing with the gas. There might be something else to keep heat away.
Yeah. So with that, you know, we go back to that idea.
So one thing that groups are starting to do, often sometimes a few leaders, spreading it out into the companies, spreading it out across departments. And so looking at, again, making their own strategic map to the future that might have both, you know, what's happening outside where they get clear on those external trends, what they might do, how does that affect what we do, our product, our service, whether we're education or an NGO or a company or a government, and how would we organize, who would we engage, how would we, what kind of new talents might we need and capabilities, what's our culture and our values, really getting a blueprint of that whole picture about where we're headed in the future.
So with that as a background, imagine you're a leader, you've gotten your people together, you thought about how does that impact who we are in the world, the kind of products we're pursuing. Think back to the roof that's white now instead of black, or whatever it is. How do we reorganize ourselves? What you can then do more practically, look at, okay, let's take a look at our footprint. How could we reduce greenhouse gases, do whatever we need to do to reduce the size of our footprint? But also, more importantly now, with that perspective, as moving into, from one planet into another, is what are the regenerative things we must now do, right? What are the highest impact actions we can do to take, to help with climate repair, climate restoration? Practical things that will make a difference around reduction, around removal, about cooling and restoration. And then,
what kind of voice will we have? So if handprint is what we're doing, there's also something important about what we're saying, the people that we're getting to engage with us, how we're engaging other people. So we had started with footprint and handprint and realized that voice was equally important.
And then we talked with Emily.
Yeah.
And now we're really
one of you will be in a group with a voice, a person who
really gets
voice.
right. But voice is important because voice, think back even to the Microsoft story. Once they have given themselves a voice, they then understand, hey, we need to connect with others and make our voice heard, and then connect with them. Or think of the leader of Walmart, right? He gave himself a voice around this topic. Now that allows for engagement that otherwise might not have been possible. So here's just a few examples, right? So this is a blueprint we did with an automotive
right. So they made interiors and products for automotives inside of the cars. And so they looked at how to become more sustainable. And they'd been looking at their materials, but then they were also looking at their building and facilities, but their building didn't have that much room for solar roof. So they were thinking about, they were surrounded by a lot of agriculture farming lands. And so could they do something, a new field developing called agrovoltaics, where you shade certain plants that need it, but you also have lots of room to generate solar energy. And so that's where they use that to get the energy for their company. And
what's really remarkable there, it creates an entirely new relationship with their community where they are, right? So that's what's so cool about that. Here's another really interesting example that was really relevant during the past, the storm that just happened in Florida, where there's one community 15 miles away from a town that was completely destroyed, Fort Myers. And they didn't, there was not a roof that had been damaged. The electricity never went out because they had 680,000 solar panels. They had designed a town specifically to be able to survive the kind of storm that Fort Myers did not, right? So that's the kind of stuff we're seeing.
So they had continuous power when so much of Florida all around them lost power for quite a long time.
This was a fun one. This is a local restaurant, and we had a conversation with the owner, Lumi, Gardner, and with her, you see the personal commitment she made to this change. She made some really interesting choices about the products, has very unique and very specific demands of her suppliers and distributors, which now has led them to actually go to their other customers and say, look what we're doing. We're doing regenerative stuff, because they were pressured by Lumi to do it. Now they're in a new business. She's doing it all kinds of things with her employees. She's built it into the basic protocol of how they interact with their customers. The customers love it. There's incredible reviews, and they're now seen as a company with a voice, right? They are seen as a sustainability and climate leader. This is an interesting one from one of the colleagues. I don't know whether he's here today, but it's a local company called BioCare, an Australian company, and they make it possible for farming companies, plantations, to take their, let's say, sugarcane, for example, and turning into biochar, into an inert substance that no longer puts the carbon into the atmosphere, either as methane or as CO2. These are hugely important technologies that allow you to shift into this kind of regenerative world.
Another one that I like a lot that I saw just in the last week or so is one from Dutch students, and they invented cartridges that you put in cars, and electric cars, so that they pull in the CO2 from the air as they drive. And so they don't get a lot per car. It's not a huge mega facility, but there's lots of cars on the road. So if each car drives every day, gets the cartridge full, when they go to recharge the car, they have a place to put the cartridges, exchange to a new cartridge, drive the next day. and fill up a new cartridge. And so they're really designing first the cartridge for the car and the technology, and then the whole network or infrastructure of how to deal with that and how to collect the CO2 and where it can go.
So this is the second to last slide to kind of frame the conversation you're going to have in a few minutes. And that is, our dream really is based on this understanding that we must get on the highway to a livable planet, that we look at everything we do and think about how can it become an instrument for repair, for restoration, instead of simply an instrument for transportation, right? Instead of a ship being, a container ship being something that moves from, let's say, China to Australia or to California or to wherever it goes to transport material, how could that ship become an instrument for repair? It goes through the atmosphere. There's stuff happening in the air. It could have sensors that identify, hey, wait a minute, there's a methane burst. Could we put some kind of an aerosol out to neutralize that methane? We're going through plastic in the ocean. Could we pick that up? Is there some capability where that ship becomes an instrument for restoration, an instrument for repair? There are nets floating around that shouldn't be. Can we pick those up? Do we have some kind of robotic arms that are attached to the ship and turn that into something that it is currently not?
There's research going on iron fertilization in the ocean, where very tiny, minute amounts of iron can fertilize the algae growth, and the algae draws down the carbon and then also becomes fish food as well. And so there are people who are trying to research that and see for these boats that are already out there, is that something that they could be doing? And so this is the last one of just understanding kind of the ripple of like the expanding circles of impact that we can have. It may start with a product or service, whatever it is that you're doing, to think, how can this thing that I'm making
Like
or
that
my
ship or
day-to-day
that car, right, or that restaurant.
So whatever you're the expert in, how can you take your expertise and make it in that circle be something where you could say, what would it become in the regenerative era? It may also be the process. It may be from beginning to end, not just the output of what you're doing. It could be the facility, about where you're doing that. Where is that work happening? What could you do in that kind of facility in terms of energy or materials? What about the whole business model? Lots of groups have changed from selling a product to a service, like carpet, that we're saying carpet as a service, so they'd take it back and people wouldn't have to buy whole new carpets, but they just repair the part that needed repair. There've been lots of things over the years about looking at more sustainable business models. Sometimes then it could be the whole company focus, so not just particular areas, but what if you engage everyone? And how many people would have their own ideas because they'd know their own area better and they would know how to apply these principles to their own area? And then a lot of companies focus on it, but they don't go public with it. They don't make it their brand. What if you did bring in voice? What if you make it part of the brand and let people see what it is you're doing and spread not just all of these sustainable products and services and ways of operating, but send the story out into the world as well.
That goes all the way back to that signal we talked about around young people, right? Like you better have something like that if you want to be attractive to the young people who expect to work for a company like that.
Yeah, so they want to know at the rate. So that makes a big difference in terms of what is the real, if it's an authentic brand, what is that identity of place they're joining? What are they doing and where are they going? You can engage your customers in that discussion as well. And then particularly important suppliers and partners, like in the seafood restaurant, right, is that they really got all of the suppliers and distributors to be interested in something that they might not have been interested in before, to really be educated and to know about it and to join in that work together. And then someone is going out for their industry to say, we're going to lead our industry. We're going to change our whole industry. We're not going to compete on this. We're not going to compete on these regenerative actions that we're going to take. We can compete on everything else, on our brand, on our customer experience, on what the product and service is, but we're not going to compete on climate. We're going to see together, how can we innovate and change our whole industry, work together on that, have leadership and advocacy.
So basically, we want you to think about this mind shift, right? If we really take seriously that we have to create a livable planet again through adaptation, reduction, removal, cooling, and restoration, what comes to mind? What comes to mind in your daily work, in the kind of products and services you provide? And so there we would like you to just think about this again, think about it in the context of footprint, handprint, and voice. What are you taking away from this new framing, and how might that inform you in terms of the kind of actions you might want to take?